Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 4 of the hearing of submissions on the Selwyn District Plan. Just before we turn to our first submitter, which is Fonterra Limited, 42A Reporting Officer. I can't call you a team this morning because you're by yourself. Anything for us? All right. So good morning and welcome. I think, Mr. Williams, you were here yesterday, so you know the form, but I'll just repeat it for the sake of your witnesses. Thank you very much for pre-circulating your written material, which we appreciate. We've read that, so you don't need to read that out loud to us again. I see you've tabled some summary documents, so we're happy for you just when we come to the witnesses for them just to be read out to us word for word. And if the witnesses are going to interpolate verbally, if they could indicate that so we can just make a good record of what the actual evidence is. Okay, but over to you, thank you.
Oops, sorry, that was the speaker on. In terms of context for the Fonterra site, there's probably the closest parallels are with the LPC situation, where we have a site-specific zoning. In this case, for the Fonterra site, that was achieved through the Plan Change 50 process, and we have an existing dairy processing management area. Probably the one point of difference just to note in terms of very broad introduction is the Fonterra site in its entirety extends well beyond that area, with particularly wastewater disposal and the likes occurring on rural land beyond the immediate site zoning. So reverse sensitivity and incompatible activities are engaged not only in respect of the DPMA, as we refer to it as, but also the wider property or operation. So and in later hearings, for example, I'm not going to cover it now, one of the issues we'll need to work through is the seemingly intent of Darfield to start creeping up the state highway towards the site. So that's all I was going to say. I'm very conscious that a lot was discussed yesterday, and equally the planners have done a lot of work behind the scenes to reach a position which was threshed out a bit more yesterday. So that's going to be it from me.
All right, thanks very much, Mr. Williams. We'll just see if we do have any questions for you. Andrew, any questions from the legal submissions?
Yes, thank you. I do have just one. Paragraph 13 of your evidence, legal submission. So you say in that statement, in that paragraph 13, the inclusion of the Darfield site as important infrastructure is essential for ensuring the significance of the site for the district, region, nation, and nation is appropriately recognised, and the future operation of the site is protected. So is it really essential that it's described as important infrastructure? I've done a word search in Mr. Crystal's evidence, and I didn't see the word essential in there. Potentially, perhaps one of your other witnesses wants to answer that. So I'm just querying that sort of, is it really essential? And my second question is, if it had similar protection in the plan, the noise provisions and other things and policy support, would that be sufficient while not being defined as important infrastructure? I'm just trying to get clear in my mind why it's essential that it's defined as important infrastructure.
Look, and I'm anticipating the position of Fonterra vis-a-vis important infrastructure will be a matter of detailed evidence in a future hearing. Certainly, we've approached this on the basis of what's proposed in the plan, to state the obvious, with the Selwyn district in the context of strategic directions, recognising that dairy processing and manufacturing is, whether it's the word essential, a key component, a key aspect, an important aspect of the Selwyn district. We certainly appreciate there is a difference in approach between, for example, the CRPS approach to significant infrastructure there and what's occurring in the Selwyn district, but equally we see Selwyn district quite appropriately looking at what's occurring in its district and recognising that dairy processing is an essential part or a core part of the district. Is it essential it's recognised as important infrastructure? I think given that premise and the structural approach of the plan, notified plan to date, I certainly see if the strategic direction of giving effect to recognise the importance of dairy manufacturing is to be given effect to, then it should be recognised as such. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
even if the plan had the same protections for it, but it itself was not called essential infrastructure.
It's a matter of consistency. I appreciate that. As I see it, the counter to that proposition is that nothing would need to be important infrastructure if you just had rules and objectives and policies on an individual, whether it's ports, Orion, or whatever. The decision has been made in the proposed plan to recognise dairy manufacturing as important infrastructure. I think that's appropriate, and it'd be nice to see consistency in relation to that treatment. I certainly accept the point ultimately that if all the individual objectives and policies and rules as they relate to dairy processing and manufacturing give effect to the same outcome, well, then perhaps we are looking a little bit at how we skin the cat in a different way, but I still come back to the general proposition that what we're actually wanting to do here is consistency in terms of the district's approach to recognising what it sees as important infrastructure in its district, and that includes dairy manufacturing.
Okay, thank you.
Cool.
No.
Yeah. Lindsay? Yeah. Just as a follow-up question to the question from my colleague, has any submitter, to your knowledge, asked for dairy processing to be removed from the definition of important infrastructure?
I don't. I'm doing this a little bit off the top of my head, and Mr. Crystal maybe will assist out. I don't think anyone submitted aggressively, if you like, seeking that dairy manufacturing be removed from the definition of important infrastructure. We do have at least one submission, maybe two submissions floating out there. The one I'm thinking of is ECAN's realignment with the CRPS definition of significant infrastructure. Again, I don't see that as being determinative of what not only Selwyn but every other district that's subject to the CRPS does in terms of its important things. Yeah.
Okay, but as far as you can recall, no one's actually asked for that to be removed.
Is that right? Yeah, so it's just an alignment with the CRPS point rather than a specific submission.
Sorry, I've got a question around basically clarification. In your submission, you actually mentioned about your special purpose zone that you have at Darfield. You have a special purpose zone with Sinlay. We also have Westland Milk that's an I zone. That doesn't have a special purpose zone. So are you asking sort of to recognise just yourselves as special purpose zones with your ability to manage strategic assets, right? When you compare against Westland Milk, which actually has its processing factory and discharge point at the Pines wastewater at iZone?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So obviously there's a bit of history with this, with Sinlay having been through what was Plan Change 43 and Fonterra with its Plan Change 50. So I guess that was the starting point in terms of how the proposed plan was formulated. I guess just putting that into context, both the Sinlay and the Fonterra sites would otherwise be in rural zones, whereas Westland, I don't speak for Westland, but I'm assuming they're sitting in a business zone at the moment with a range of effects that are a bit different. And the example you gave of the disposal of wastewater being to the municipal plant has been an example of that. So, yeah.
Right, thank you, Mr. Williams. We can hear from your witnesses now.
So we'll now turn to Harriet.
I can do that last part. Ten Grote Katerwal. My name is Harriet van Genne-Knaper. That's how you pronounce it. And I'm the Darfield and Upper South Operations Manager. And in that role, I'm looking after the milk processing sites in Darfield, Takaka and Brightwater, and the reverse osmosis concentration plants in Tumarina and Colveden. I have been in that role since February 2019 and with Fonterra since 2016. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to present today. On behalf of Fonterra, we would like to express our gratitude to the Selwyn District Council for the open and engaging approach that they have taken on this process. A little bit more about Darfield. So the site was opened in 2012 and it can now process up to 7.2 million liters of milk per day. And we produce a broad range of whole milk powder and cream cheese products. We receive milk from across Canterbury region and we employ about 280 people. A lot of them are living in the Selwyn district region. We are very active in the local community and proud to support local fundraising initiatives and the community events. Fonterra must have the capacity to process the maximum volume of milk produced on supplier farms at any time, whether this is during the peak milk production period or in case of a plant failure in the region. Given its size and product mix, Darfield has a key role to play in this. The Darfield site at the time was selected by Fonterra due to its proximity to labour force and supplier farms, connectivity with transport networks to other Fonterra sites, and the ability to locate in a rural environment with minimal sensitivity receivers, and the ability to acquire farmland to irrigate wastewater generated on site to land. We are very committed to reducing our environmental footprint, and we have adopted a number of initiatives over the last couple of years at Darfield site. And this has included the investment and installing of a reversed osmosis water treatment plant, which significantly reduces the water intake to site. We also just installed a biodigester that eliminates the need to spread whey to land as a byproduct of the cream cheese manufacturing process. The discharge of processed water onto neighboring farms has been a common practice across the dairy industry for some time. Fonterra is making continual improvements to the quality of its wastewater and other waste products and adopting new technologies as they become available. However, the irrigation of wastewater to land and generation of noise at manufacturing sites can lead to reverse sensitivity effects. Fonterra has invested significantly in planning processes that have enabled establishment and continued operation of the Darfield site. This includes 2 significant resource consent hearings and a plan change that established the dairy processing management area notation for the site and the associated noise control boundary. Reversed sensitivity impacts have implications for where Fonterra chooses to invest and expand. The Darfield manufacturing site is currently insulated by significant surrounding farmlands and rural zoning. However, the establishment of new sensitive land uses could effectively limit further development. In order for Fonterra Darfield to continue operating effectively and efficiently, the significance of the site must be appropriately recognized in the strategic direction section for the new district plan. And in particular, that sensitive activities in the proximity of the special purpose dairy processing zone must be avoided. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll see if we have questions for you. Mark, any questions?
Yes, I was just looking at the district plan map to see exactly where the growth overlay was. But my question is more general, just to get a picture in my head of your activities and the rural sensitivity issue, reverse sensitivity issues around that boundary. Is it the noise from the general farming activities and the irrigation, or is it an odour from the wastewater that has that potential, if urban growth moves up to your boundary, to cause those issues?
Yeah, sorry.
This is Miss Buckley.
Nice.
The oracle knowledge.
No, not really. Look, it's for irrigation, it's the odour and the spray drift aspect of it, and it's not so much that the odour is non-compliant, it's about the sensitivity of that particular receptor to that type of odour, and it's similar with farming activities with silage or dairy farm dairy. So, you know, I can live in a rural environment and I sort of think that's normal, but if you're introduced into it, you can perceive it to be non-compliant and objective.
Thank you. I can understand that I live in a rural environment with a pig farm not far away, and if the wind blows the wrong way on the wrong day, it can be tasty. So thank you. That just sets the scene as to what we're talking about. Thank you.
Lindsay?
No,
Deborah?
thank you.
Gary?
No, thank you.
Carl? Rowan? Yep. Yep.
just a small point. Your paragraph 24.1, you talk about marai's sensitive activities that include marae in that. And then in your submission on page 7 in the table, under sensitive activities, marae is not included. Was that just an oversight?
This one here.
That may be an oversight. I'm just assuming that Mariah is not included within community facility, which I don't think it is. So.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Mark's already asked my question.
Yeah, just a point of clarification. I think it relates to the first question. I just want to get it clear in my mind. So thank you for the map that you've included in paragraph 13. That's really helpful. So just so I'm clear, so it's not just the effects from the activities in the building, but also effects from the activities on the land around the building that you also own that you're also concerned about.
Yes, yeah, and
Okay.
the farmland isn't the dairy processing manufacturing area.
Yep, got it. No, thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you.
No further questions from me, thank you.
Thank you. Someone with a surname that's a little bit easier to say wasn't Mr. Crystal now. So.
But there's nothing wrong with Dutch surnames or having.
No, I fully agree. After a number of years, I've managed to, I think, pronounce yours reasonably well.
Good morning, everyone. I've just got a brief summary, and it's just on a single piece of paper, but I was being environmentally friendly, so I've double-sided that. So important infrastructure is, in my view, the backbone of the community and is pivotal to ensuring the district is well functioning and achieves social, cultural, and economic well-being and health and safety outcomes. As such, I support the recognition of important infrastructure in the strategic directions. To ensure that important infrastructure is appropriately enabled, protected and managed, I was part of a group of planning experts from CIL, LPC, Orion and Sinlay who discussed and agreed positions on a number of objectives and obviously created new policy, which you're now aware of. I consider the agreed position better articulate and provide the necessary overarching direction required to recognise the significant and important infrastructure in the district. In the context of Fonterra, proposed policy SDIR P1 reflects its operational bottom line, which must be achieved in order to support the efficient and effective operation of their business. I also consider that to recognise this bottom line in strategic directions provides a clear direction up front on how objective SDIR02 is to be implemented and will ensure that subsequent provisions achieve the required outcomes. While I acknowledge that, as far as I'm aware, policies have not been utilised in other district plans, strategic directions chapters, I simply note that the inclusion of policies in strategic directions is provided for in the national planning standards. In my opinion, important infrastructure such as Fonterra's Starfield manufacturing plant is of such significance to the district's social, cultural and economic well-being of the community and its health and safety that a strategic, objective and policy framework should leave no room for guessing. In my view, therefore, this significance should ideally be recognised and provided for at the beginning of the district plan, i.e. within strategic directions, rather than in subsequent chapters where the overarching importance can be somewhat lost. With respect to urban form and development provisions, I consider the amendments to recognise reverse sensitivity, avoiding incompatible activities and important infrastructure is critical. While I acknowledge that urban growth and development is a key issue for the council, it is important that growth and development does not occur at all costs and undermine important infrastructure and existing activities in the rural environment. Overall, I consider the amendments proposed to strategic direction chapter set out in my evidence in chief better articulate and provide for the necessary overarching direction to recognise the significance of important infrastructure within several districts and guide development accordingly.
Thank you for that. I'll see if we have questions for you, Andrew. Any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple. Thank you for evidence, Mr. Crystal. So the first question Do you know if similar milk processing plants are classified as infrastructure in other district plans? I'm just trying to get an idea of whether that's a similar approach or not.
I'm trying to think whether any have been done since the national planning stand. I don't know. I'm not aware that there are any others that I'm aware of
Okay.
at this stage.
Thank you. And paragraph 21, you refer to Fonterra's submission to UFD01. And I wasn't sure if this was one you were supporting because it's not included in your attachment A.
So that's because attachment A addresses the submissions across the board. So that's their Ryan, CIL,
Right.
LPC. This was a Fonterra only
Okay.
one, so that's why it's sitting in my evidence rather than in the attachment.
Thank you. But in paragraph 24, you said you consider the revisions to 01 are appropriate. So looking at the recommended changes to UFD 01,
Yep.
you're seeking to avoid reverse sensitivity effects on improved existing and permitted activities. So that goes beyond infrastructure or important infrastructure. It's all activities. Okay. So I'm just trying to get clear in my mind, and I do wonder whether, would you ever get urban growth? Because it would always be potentially have reverse sensitivities on a permitted activity in a rural farming environment. I'm just trying to work out, would you ever achieve it? Would you ever get urban growth at all if that was the case?
Well, I think there are issues associated with particular activities which you need to address if you're looking at urban growth. I mean, it's not all farming activities where reverse sensitivity effects might occur. So in this case, we're talking about a irrigation farm. So yes, you're right. This is different from the dairy processing zone. So we're talking about an irrigation farm here, where there are potential effects, which Ms. Buckley has already outlined. That's very different from a farm which is just not irrigating straight water, for example, or is just sheep and cattle grazing or anything like that. I think there's quite a difference between that.
Yeah. So do you appreciate that it's quite challenging to apply if you were assessing a plan change or an application and you're looking at this for urban growth and it has to avoid reverse sensitivity effects on approved existing and permitted activity. So I'm still not sure how much direction that then gives to people who are willing to or wishing to intensify or rezone or redevelop when they have to consider all those matters.
It stems directly from the RPS.
Yeah, okay.
So, you know, that's policy 532, avoid reverse sensitivity effects, conflicts from incompatible activities. That's where it stems from. So the direction comes from the RPS.
Okay. All right. I'm just querying how
I fully understand what you're saying, but I think there is a difference between activities,
okay,
which you're looking to avoid. There's a big difference between a cropping farm or a sheep and beef farm and a pig farm, for example, in terms of trying to avoid reverse sensitivity effects.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
In your paragraphs 20 and onwards, you discuss urban growth.
Mm-hmm.
Does that include residential growth?
Yes.
So we heard earlier in the week from Mr. Thompson on behalf of Galena nominee group and Trices Road rezoning group, who considered urban growth did not include residential growth. Yesterday, we heard from Mr. Phillips from the Carter Group, who said that yes, urban growth does include residential growth. Given this obvious confusion, do you think that there should be a definition for urban growth?
I would have thought urban growth included residential development and includes industrial development expansion. I'm not sure where Mr. Thompson's coming from in suggesting that it doesn't. I think it's pretty clear. Urban growth is urban. And it would include residential development. It doesn't include, obviously, the single dwelling on a 20 hectare or 100 hectare farm. That's not, I don't even call that urban growth, but certainly in terms of growth of a township, which is more than likely residential development or for industrial commercial development. To me, that's urban growth.
Well, what might be clear to one person obviously isn't clear to the next.
Yes, I see that. I
Yeah,
had never
thank you.
hadn't anticipated that. Look, if it needs a definition, then I'd support that. If you believe it's unclear and it needs a definition, then I'd have no problem in supporting that.
Mr. Crystal, yeah, just one question, just in relation to your paragraph 19A, make the point that in opposition to what the reporting officer is recommending, you appreciate the streamlined approach that's been taken, but you believe that, strategic objectives should be should explain what they mean and be quite detailed, I guess. And I guess there's a balance for us between, in terms of the structure of the plan, in terms of a streamlined approach and potentially going the other way to very detailed. And in P1, we talked about P1 yesterday to some extent, and it is very detailed. And yeah, I just wanted to test with you, because that, as I understand, is a standalone policy that sits in the strategic direction underneath an objective, which would be quite different to the way the plan's currently structured. So maybe if you could just address us on that. And the second part of the question is, are those matters dealt with in the lower order objectives anyway, in terms of the noise, the specifics about noise contours and those sorts of things, noise levels? Are they already dealt with in the lower level documents? So that potentially got a duplication issue here as well. So just want your comments on that. Thanks.
Okay, so yeah, I anticipated this might rise. Look, as I sort of said earlier on, if you go to as a starting point, national planning standards and the mandatory direction on strategic directions, it says there that policies that address these matters, unless those policies are better located in more specific chapters. Okay, so that's the mandatory direction. There's nothing in the Section 32 assessment which tells you why the unless has dropped down any further. So the starting point would be, surely you consider the policies within strategic directions first, and then decide, okay, if you're not going to have them, here's the reasons why. There is no reasons why, as far as I can see. So that's I guess that's the first point to make. Yes, I agree that there is a consistency issue or a standardization issue. I think one of the dangers with strategic directions and objectives in strategic directions, and look, I think this is not just a Selwyn thing, I think this is more a national thing, is that we tend to start dressing objectives up as policies. The Christchurch City Plan is a very good example of that, where essentially we have objectives dressed up as policies. I mean, I'm a bit old-fashioned. An objective is what you want to achieve, and a policy is how you're going to do that. If you're going to have a policy in strategic directions, then surely your primary or key infrastructure is one of those where you would do that. I accept that you could move it into the infrastructure chapter. One of the, and this gets to the second point that you're making, one of the issues that does arise, particularly for the ports and the dairy processing plants, is that you end up with you jump from strategic directions, strategic objectives, to infrastructure, to their zones. So they end up in essentially in three chapters, if you like. You're addressing three chapters in order to, in assessing any consent, you're looking at you trying to jump through all three chapters. So that's one of the dangers. It's not the same for some of the other infrastructure, which I accept.
Is that not exacerbated by having it also in the strategic objectives, having that detailed policy? And so if it's in three areas, why don't we take it out of the strategic objectives?
Yeah, look, I accept it, and I think I made a point up front. Ideally located, but if you have it in strategic directions, then you wouldn't want to repeat that in the infrastructure chapter.
Thank you for that. We did have some discussion on that.
Look, I fully accept that you can drop it into the infrastructure chapter if you agree that it's a policy. I'm not I'm not here to die in a ditch about it being there. The point I'm making is that, though, that the direction from the national planning standards is to start with strategic directions and policies there and then drop down and give some reasons why you're going to go down there. So that's the first point to make. And I can't find anywhere where that's been addressed. The second point is, if you're going to have any policies and strategic directions, I would have thought at the very least your top infrastructure, key infrastructure would be one of those.
Thank you, Mr. Crystal. I have two questions. One is following on from what's already been asked, and it's referred to in your paragraph 12. If we were to look at including reverse sensitivity issues or adding reverse sensitivity issues to our strategic objectives, if you go to your lower form, and I've actually picked this up with regards to your urban growth, you wanted to add a new clause where you say does not compromise existing and consenting farming practices. And I just wondered, with regards to consented farming practices, could you clarify if environmental management plans under the requirement from Environment Canterbury would be considered as a consented process?
Are they consented? I'm not sure they are. I thought they were voluntary.
I can probably the honest answer to that is sometimes they're consented and sometimes they're not. So there is a possible permitted activity pathway for some farming operations. Equally, and I'm sure your fellow commissioner can clarify this with you, equally some farming operations will be the subject of consented requirements for FEPs, as we call them, farm environment plans.
Thank you. I just want a clarification around your interpretation. The other is the inclusion of reverse sensitivity at a higher order with regards to, I guess, rural subdivision and the creation of 1 hectare farming, or what people are terming lifestyle blocks, scattered throughout the rural. What we allowed in our last plan and what we've allowed to continue in this plan in our rural zones is where a landowner can take a minimum of 1 hectare and covenant a no-build covenant over the rest of the 19 hectares over their land. With regards to the establishment of that, because it's 1 hectare, I'll say lifestyle block in that rural zone, does that have the potential to conflict with regards to having reverse sensitivity higher up in our strategic directions?
I don't think so. The issues around reverse sensitivity would still apply. So if you're locating inside a noise contour or trying to locate inside a noise contour or whatever, those issues would still have to be addressed. So I don't see an issue.
Thank you.
And I just might add on to that. So I don't think Fonterra submitted on a specific point. I see one of the proposals, well, one of the approach in the proposed plan is to include some additional requirements for either 1 hectare having to share a 50% of its boundary with the balanced lots, so to speak. So I think that, I'm only guessing, is probably intended to reduce the risk of a proliferation of 1 hectare lots alongside a sensitive activity, for example, or the dairy processing site in this case. Rather, you would still have 20 hectare blocks sitting there, albeit that the legal title sitting under them would include a 1 hectare block sharing a 50% of its boundary with the balance of 19 in that case. So in terms of what that means for reverse sensitivity, I think it's probably a bit of a separate issue. The wider reverse sensitivity issue still stands and needs to be carefully managed. And I think the proposed plan, the covenanting arrangement, is at least attempting to avoid an increase in reverse sensitivity effects.
Good morning, Mr. Crystal. Yesterday, we traversed with the number of the planning witnesses your appendix of the changes which you had agreed. Presume you've had an opportunity to have a chat to Mr. Bonus, potentially,
How we chat, yes.
about the line of questioning, and a number of the issues have been traversed by Commissioner Wallace and Commissioner Ray already. But I just have one question about, well, in fact, I've got two questions. One is about the sort of the structural integrity of the plan, about having a policy here. And assuming if you were going to be having a policy here, you would also want policies in terms of implementing things like urban growth or potentially some other environmental policies to be included under strategic direction. So is there a benefit of just having this, or should there be a real reevaluation of policies under strategic directions more widely, when the approach that the council has at the moment is to put the detail actually in the relevant, either the zone chapters or the district-wide chapters?
Yeah, I sort of traversed that a little bit with Commissioner Ray as well. My view has been that I've always felt that we've missed a trick here, and that we should have been putting policies into strategic directions. And I'm talking broadly here. In this context, I think I fully understand the issue around uniformity of the plan, and I think there are some objectives that do stand alone and probably don't need policies going with them. But I would agree with you that urban growth would be another area that probably would need to follow on potentially with policies. There may be one or two others. I haven't gone back and gone through them and actually looked at that. I think you can have a strategic directions chapter which has some policies, and not every objective follows through with a policy. I think you can do that. And as I said earlier, I think that you can do, you would need to choose those ones which do require some further direction about what are you going to achieve, what is this objective looking to achieve. And my view would be strategic infrastructure would be one of those, or important infrastructure one of those. I think urban growth is probably the other key one in that space.
At a principal level, though, wouldn't that potentially dilute the importance of the other chapters, which are particularly focused on particular issue, energy and infrastructure, for example? It's got a number of separate objectives and policies which are really much more focused on detail, as opposed to these objectives, which are at that very high level. They're outcome statements at a strategic level, whereas the implementation is left to the later chapters. So it's I think you might have already answered that. But
look, and as I said earlier, my view was ideally I'm not going to die in that ditch. And if you felt that it was better located or better drafted within within the infrastructure chapter, then I'm more than comfortable with that. As I said, though, the only issue that does create for some of the important infrastructures, not all, but some, is that you end up with in about 3 different locations in terms of dropping down through the plan. So,
okay, I accept that. Okay, and then in terms of the list, and it was a question I asked yesterday as well. It was cobbled together, but I understand reasonably just before the evidence was due to be submitted by those a group of planners. Was there any thought to how comprehensive that list needed to be? I noticed things like state highways aren't in there, rail lines aren't in there. It doesn't specifically mention transmission or telecommunications or any of the other good infrastructure that society needs to actually provide.
I think I've said in my statement that, look, if you felt that there was scope to go further, then I'd be quite supportive of that. Did we talk to anyone else? No, no, we didn't. I have had emails since asking why, but I guess the question is, it comes around scope, to be honest. And I haven't looked at that broadly enough to see whether there is scope for the other important infrastructure to be included in that list or not.
Yeah.
It may
It's
well
a matter of scope, but also isn't it a matter of you haven't done a section 32 on whether it's necessary and whether it's all encompassing and whether the costs and benefits of doing that as well.
Yep, agree. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Crystal, just got a number of things I'd like to ask you about. The first one is in response to questions asked by my colleague about reverse sensitivity. You said that avoiding reverse sensitivity is mandated by the RPS, and you referred to policy or objective 532. But that's not quite correct, is it? Because 532 subclause 2 is avoid or mitigate reverse sensitivity. So it's not mandated by the RPS, is it? There's an option.
No, yes, correct. There is an option. Sorry. I think the point I was making is that's where what's been drafted has come from.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask you about the change you're recommending. So I'm looking at your attachment A, the change you're recommending to SD-IR-01. And Mr. Williams's legal submissions at his para 13 talked about the need to provide protection for the Darfield site operation. Paragraph 2 of your summary today, you talk about ensuring that important infrastructure is protected. Yet I see in the change that you're recommending to us in your SD-IR-01, you've crossed out protected, even though council and yourself seem to think it's a good idea to use that phraseology. I'm just wondering if you could explain why that's the case.
I've got to be slightly careful here because that was an objective that Fonterra supported. So if you allow me to indulge slightly wider than what Fonterra's submission is that if that's...
Or if you
so
could,
Fonterra's submission was to retain.
Well, if your position is that you don't support the change in your appendix, then you should let us know that.
Oh, look, I support the change. It wasn't a submission of Fonterra's. It wasn't an objective that Fonterra sought initially to change. So,
all right. Well, then, can you explain why you support deleting the phrase protected?
I think that objective is about the benefits of important infrastructure. I accept that the word protected could be in there. I think that objective potentially could be reworded in a different way as well if you felt that was necessary. I wouldn't say I'm wedded to not including the word protected if you felt that was necessary.
Okay. And I think you said in answer to an earlier question that in your view, an objective is about achieving an outcome. Is that correct? Or is this it's supposed to signify the outcome to be achieved?
What you want to achieve.
Yeah. The redrafting of SD-IR-01 as a decision maker, all it would require me is to recognise some things. That's not an outcome, is it? It's a process. What does recognising something achieve if you don't state within the objective the outcome to be achieved, which, as notified, was the protection of that infrastructure?
Yeah, as I said, that look, I did talk to Mr. Bonus about this one yesterday when he came back, and look, I agree that could be reworded to be better worded.
Or perhaps just left as notified.
Yeah, I'm more convinced that it'd be better to redraft that in terms of what the benefits of important infrastructure are rather than how it was notified. Because the way it's notified is talking about the important infrastructure needs of the community are fulfilled. I'm not quite sure that that's really what needs to be achieved in terms of important infrastructure.
Okay, just one further question about reverse sensitivity generally. And a question was raised by one of the commissioners yesterday about, in terms of the strategic objectives, how many times do we need to refer to reverse sensitivity? Some of the changes being sought by yourself and your colleagues would see it mentioned in the strategic directives several times. So I just wanted to ask you about the relief that's been sought by another submitter, Horticulture New Zealand. And they've asked us to add on to strategic objective SD-DI-02. Do you have that in front of you, or do you have the plan there? It's not in your appendix.
Hang on. Which one was it? 02.
It's SD-D1-02. So it's in the district identity part of the strategic objectives.
Yep.
And if Mr. Williams doesn't have the plan there, do we have?
It's up there.
There you go, on the screen. So, I mean, the issue that's been raised before us is the need, some submitters are saying there's a need to talk about incompatible activities, which, and the evidence to us from those submitters is that that's different from reverse sensitivity. And so Horticulture New Zealand suggested that just the words reverse sensitivity should be added to SD-D102, given that incompatible activities are already in that as notified. If we were minded to do that, wouldn't that achieve the outcome that yourself and all the other planning witnesses for the infrastructure submitters are trying to achieve?
Looking to add the word reverse sensitivity after incompatible activities, is that what it is?
Yeah, and the effects of reverse sensitivity are the words that they suggested.
So protected from incompatible activities and reverse sensitivity, or were you suggesting, are they suggesting taking out the words incompatible activities?
No, they made the point that it's important to leave those words in, given that the evidence from some submitters is an incompatible activity is different than a reverse sensitivity effect.
Yep.
And they said, well, that objective there already talks about infrastructure, it already talks about existing activities, it already talks about incompatible activities. And so they thought all you needed to do to have a nice objective was add the effects of reverse sensitivity. And then it's said comprehensively and once.
Yep. Yep, you could do that. It's the reference there is not to important infrastructure, it's to all infrastructure, I think, in that one, isn't it?
That's even better thing, isn't it? Important infrastructure would be a subset of infrastructure.
By definition. Not sure whether that's in the definition or not. But yes, you could do that.
All right, well, thank you very much for that. No further questions from me. Mr. Williams, thanks very much for coming in and presenting the material that you have presented to us.
Thank you. And just for completeness for the record, you should also have a brief from Mr. Copeland, who's not appearing. So, and I'm not proposing to answer questions in respect to that.
No, we think we indicated we had no questions to Mr. Copeland. His evidence was reasonably similar across the 4 or 5 submitters that he appeared for. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much. So now that concludes the hearing from submitters this morning. So Mr. Love, I think I asked you yesterday if you could read back to us the list of homework that the panel has asked you to address in your reply report. And if you could read through that slowly, and then I'll ask the panel members if there's anything they wish to add to that. But I might, if you guys want to,
You're happy for us.
yeah, maybe we'll just pause for a minute and we'll let Fonterra vacate.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
So
The
lots
homework
of
list.
homework. So the first thing was come up with a potential definition for minimizers.
Mhm.
Is there scope for amendments as suggested by the Trices Road Group in their evidence, paragraph 50?
And can you remind us what that was?
Not off the top of my head, sorry. I had
That's
to
right,
go
carry on.
review paragraph 50 to see
Yeah.
what the context is. Identify where in the PDP that the 5 matters raised in the proposed strategic policy are dealt with.
Yep.
advise the panel if the RPS defines what is acceptable risk in terms of natural hazards.
Or if the provisions within the notified plan in later chapters would achieve that as well.
Add that as my next
Sorry.
point. That's right. Advise if any submissions on the strategic directions chapter have sought an increase in scope from economic wellbeing to a wider wellbeing in regard to Jill Thompson's submission.
Yep.
Provide a map of at least A3 size of the urban growth overlay overtop the RPS map A area.
Yep.
Advise when selecting properties on the E-plan if the data output provides all of the relevant provisions or just the relevant overlay. I can confirm that with you now, it's just the relevant overlays, but then you can click on the overlay tab on the left-hand side and it will take you directly to the chapter. So I guess there's an indirect link to the provisions through that way. And the last one was in regards to a rural strategic objective, review the wording used by various submitters, the CCC plan wording, any other wording potentially raised in legal submissions, and come up with some potential wording that council would be comfortable with.
Yes, thank you. Now, just whiz along the panel. Is there any other homework that you'd like to be included in the reply report over and above what the officers are going to do of their own volition? Andrew?
Yeah, just.
What did I say?
No, just one. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
And it might have been in reply to Ms. Thompson, but I guess, do we need a strategic directive with regards to the Greater Christchurch Urban Development Strategy, given that under the RPS it's quite prescriptive?
But just a minute, just before you, has that actually been sought by any submitter?
I thought Mr. Thompson supported it. Yes, he did. He did. He supported. A split definition. Yeah, I've got it down in my notes as from Mr. Thompson. It was a question that he picked up because I actually did ask CCC that question. So, I guess it's just, do we need to have another strategic direction on with regards to the RPS with policy 6 versus policy 5, which is outside the UDS area. And something for the chapter, and something inside with to meet with the RPS.
So I guess the question is, do you support the submission of the Christchurch City Council that our objective should be split to differentiate between within and outside of the, whatever it's called, the urban growth area? The Greater Christchurch area. Yeah, okay, cool. So now, starting at the end of the, Andrew, anything you want to add to the homework list? Malcolm?
No, I'm happy with the list we have already.
Good. Raymond?
I'm not sure. Well, I do have something, but I'm not sure if this is to go in the strategic direction or the definitions.
We'll just float it out there and just put it out there and we'll see.
So, do we need a definition on urban growth, given the confusion between submitters?
Well, when you add it to the list, definition of urban growth, is there one anywhere in the RPS or in this plan? And if not, do you think that would assist? And has anyone asked for that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I was floating out there is the P1 list of infrastructure, which Lindsay touched on, whether there is scope to expand that. I'm not saying we're going to do that, but I'm just wondering if it's an easy exercise to check on scope for that, for adding highways and rail and so forth. But is there a merit in that or not? I don't want to put you to work for
I don't know how we would do that, since this was only floated in an evidence, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So
I think Mr. Crystal said that
people have been ringing him up.
He couldn't advise us whether there was scope or not.
Yeah, okay. Maybe if you could look at that. I mean, I suspect there's probably no scope to add to that, given that it was in evidence, not in submission. So no one would have, because further submitters wouldn't have known what the evidence was going to be.
Answer, yeah.
But you could just clarify that. Okay.
There was a number of submissions that looked at. There's a general one about putting policies in with the strategic direction. You could use that if there is that one.
Oh, there was talk about a Jill Thompson thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it might be useful for us just to know yes or no if there's an easy answer to that.
is there scope to expand SDIRP1? Should we be minded to actually even want it? Okay, Deborah. Oh, you've done yours, yeah.
I've done that. Just,
Lindsay,
just
sorry.
to follow up, there is one for rural and now there's one being proposed for urban.
What, one what?
A strategic direction. Everyone's asked for one for rural. And just to follow up, we are now looking at one for urban too. Right, that's right.
No, I don't think anything comprehensive was.
Yeah, no. Okay. Yeah, no, yeah, we already have an objective on urban growth, so. Yeah. The question that we've asked the officers to address is whether or not they support the submission of Christchurch City Council to split that objective into inside and outside the greater Christchurch area of the district, to more fully give effect to the RPS as we're mandated to do. All right. Now, is there anything that you would like us to clarify for you to make your job easier in terms of doing the reply report? Just then. All right, excellent. All right, so now we can close this part of the hearing. I understand we're going to have karakia.
Yes.
Cool.